This Be the Bridge Acts of Reconciliation Challenge takes us to the nation's capital, where we'll take a look at some of Canada's earliest celebrated figures and how they supported the cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples. I'm Sergeant Nicholas Keys, and I'm here in Ottawa at the Beechwood Cemetery. Beechwood is Canada's national cemetery and the final resting place of prime ministers, prominent business people, and the players behind some of the darkest chapters in our nation's history. While exploring the grounds of Beechwood, I met up with staff from the cemetery who explained how they were approached by Dr. Cindy Blackstock of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society about providing a more balanced account of some of the celebrated figures in the cemetery, outlining their impact on Indigenous communities. And as a result, new plaques have now been installed at some of the grave sites, explaining the details of some of the pages that were torn from our history books. And today, we're going to find them on our Reconciling History Walk. For over a century, until 1996, the Canadian government removed over 150,000 Indigenous children from their families, forcing them into church-run residential schools. Thousands of kids died at these schools and experienced physical abuse, torture, neglect, and cultural genocide. The first stop on our Reconciling History tour is the grave of Nicholas Flood Davin. Davin was a lawyer, journalist, and politician who had been honored by a large monument here at Beechwood Cemetery with a macabre-looking bust of his likeness on top. We can now read about how Davin was one of the architects of the Canadian Indian residential school system. He wrote the Davin Report for the Canadian government, applauding American efforts to concentrate Indigenous peoples on reservations and prepare their children for citizenship through industrial education. Soon after the Davin Report, several government-sponsored boarding schools opened. Next, we'll visit the grave of Duncan Campbell Scott. Classed as one of Canada's Confederation poets, among the first critically acclaimed poets to be published after the formation of the Dominion of Canada, he is also notorious for his 52-year career as Deputy Superintendent in the Department of Indian Affairs, where he oversaw the assimilationist Indian residential school system. In 2015, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission said that these residential schools amounted to cultural genocide. But there were also allies who were intentionally left out of our history. People who saw these schools for what they were and spoke out against them. We are going to visit the final resting place of a man who did just that. Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce spent months examining dozens of schools in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta and found unsanitary conditions, poor health practices, buildings that were prone to fire and lack of ventilation. In a damning report to the government in 1907, initially hidden from the public by his bosses, he wrote, "It's almost as if the prime conditions of the outbreak of epidemics has been deliberately created." The department shunned his findings. Bryce was blocked from speaking at academic conferences, and for the rest of his life he was hounded by his boss, Deputy Superintendent Duncan Campbell Scott. But Dr. Bryce didn't let this stop him, and like Dr. Cindy Blackstock continues to do today, he spoke out to try to save the lives of these kids. He was pushed out of public office, but in 1922 managed to publish his hidden report in an article, A National Crime. Even with a modest headstone in a huge national cemetery, it wasn't hard to find Peter's grave. It was alive with bright colors, an orange Every Child Matters sign, hand-painted stones, flowers, and probably the most unique feature, an orange mailbox where people leave letters of appreciation to Dr. Bryce for what he did. Thanks for joining me on this Reconciling History Walk. I'm OPP Sergeant Nicholas Keys, and I encourage you to learn about Indigenous history, cultures, and traditions, and to celebrate the achievements and contributions of Indigenous peoples.